All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining in. This webinar is hosted to you by GRCTS.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for participating in this webinar and for a particularly interesting topic in the way that FDA has treated it in terms of backing out of it. So that has to do with software and the changes that have been made over the last few years. Just to let you know that when FDA started to regulate software, we were rather ambitious and didn't know where to stop. And so it was a matter of backing off of that and realizing that we bit off too much. So here we go, and I'm ready for these topics to familiarize you where FDA has pulled back. So the first one I want to talk about is the deregulation of software, and meaning rather than include those under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, where it gave FDA legislative authority, Congress said, no, we made a mistake, so take some of this software away. So they pulled some software away from FDA's jurisdiction, which I think was very, very helpful. The next topic is not having to report recalls to FDA about cyber attacks, provided you participate in this alternative way of working out your cyber attack problems. Then we're going to talk about the use of voluntary standards in relation to software, which is really important now and will become more important in the future as FDA relies on voluntary standards, as will a number of other people in the federal government. And just so you know, that all falls under the Department of Homeland Security, so everybody in the federal government is going to have to keep up with those general guidelines. And then we're going to talk about there's a reorganization for the pre-market and post-market programs. So they're going to be handled a little differently than how FDA typically might do that. So for software, one of the major changes is that, as I said, Congress changed FDA's jurisdiction over some software. So Congress redefined what software is, which would be regulated by FDA. So in the 21st Century Cures Act, which was in place in December 13, 2016, that's when the law said, oops, so software is not here. So that made a nice change for industry and a great change for FDA because it took away a lot of the headaches for stuff that or software that really didn't present that big of a risk. And so, at least in my mind, why bother? So in conjunction with that, FDA decided to issue a draft guidance document entitled Changes to Existing Medical Software Policies Resulting from this Statute. So they're going to be trying to explain what these changes mean in terms of what it means for FDA and what it will or will not do with that software, and then for industry so they can make a decision as to whether or not their software, their particular software, happens to fall under FDA's jurisdiction or not. This is particularly helpful for mobile apps because that probably was the area with the greatest amount of confusion, not only for FDA but for industry. And so you have to take the scissors and cut that list in half, and then it's beginning to make more sense. So people in mobile apps will be happy about that. So what they were trying to accomplish was that for low-risk software, it's not going to be subject to regulation. FDA's criteria for regulating products, whether it's devices, food, and drugs, biologics, it's all based on risk to health. And so FDA is looking at the risk to health benefit of regulating a particular area. Well, there wasn't a great benefit out of regulating low-risk software. And the cost of regulating really made it sort of like silly. So anyways, they backed out of that. Then the other is that the fallout from that is that with this change in FDA's jurisdiction, that means that some guidance documents that were out there at the time require revision, or they just simply have to be withdrawn because with the change in the law, they're no longer applicable. So here's the happy list of things that move away from FDA or else need to be revised. So one is software that is used for general wellness or general wellness policy for low-risk devices. An easy example is if you happen to wear a Fitbit around your wrist, it tells you your heartbeat and how long you've walked or how many steps, or when you go to the gym and you're on a treadmill or a cross trainer, and so it's telling you, how many calories you've burned, what your heart rate is, etc. Well, none of that's about, treating or managing an illness. That's just telling what's going on with you as a healthy person in terms of that particular information. So there's no real risk about that. So FDA said we don't need to get involved with that. So that cuts out a lot of areas where FDA couldn't draw a line because some software sort of looked like it drifted into regulated software versus not. And so now a lot of it doesn't. And they're going to be redoing a guidance on that currently exists and explain that. Then also for controlling mobile apps. So a lot of medical mobile apps will be let go in terms of how they're regulated. So that's a great relief for a lot of people. And the mobile medical apps that are used, for the most part, they're going to be participating or connected up to other software devices. So that's helpful. However, the platform itself, like your phone, that's where the medical app can even be using your phone as a piece of hardware to do some sort of medical management or diagnostic work. Then you have off-the-shelf software that's used in medical devices. So off-the-shelf software means you just adapt a particular software program that anybody could buy and use, and you adapt it somehow for use in a medical device. So FDA is changing how it regulates that, and it's basically backing away. So you become responsible for off-the-shelf software once you include it into a medical device. Then it's part of your design and validation requirements. But simply to buy off-the-shelf software itself is not going to be regulated by FDA. One thing I want to point out is when you do buy off-the-shelf software and then market it for a medical purpose, you want to make sure your labeling is very clear about what that use is. FDA defines what a device is in part by its intended use. What does it do? It treats or manages medical issues, and then how is it labeled? It's intended to be used as blank. And so that can turn it into a medical device, so be careful. Then the medical device data systems, that's where you have data, like, for example, on a patient's file, and it's now in a digital basis, and you're sending it from point A to point B into another manager of data or another institution. It's basically the same thing as you might do in paper, only now it's done electronically. That was the first regulation that FDA put out to see, gee, what's going on in terms of what are people going to say when FDA says, we're going to regulate this. And so we were basically waiting for people to scream and yell and, beat the door down. It didn't happen. So we realized that we picked an area that was very safe. And quite frankly now, it doesn't need to be regulated provided it's being used by professionals. So it was just a balloon. Then finally, the submission of premarket notifications regarding medical imaging equipment, so diagnostic X-ray things, will be withdrawn. So that's going to be helpful, and that's going to change a lot of things